Imagine standing on the manicured grounds of a mansion so vast it's a self-contained world. The air hums with the faint buzz of unseen workers, all there to maintain an empty palace. No one truly lives here. The Vanderbilts, the family who built America's grandest estates, barely inhabited these homes, choosing instead to build their opulence in the form of sprawling, underused residences. Over 30 years, they constructed 10 of these monuments to wealth, but few ever called them home. Why? To flaunt their unimaginable fortune, to make a statement. The cost? Not just financial ruin, but a dynasty's eventual collapse. This is the untold tale of Gilded Age excess, where the walls whispered of empty grandeur, and the price of flexing was more than anyone could afford. The dream that demanded everything. The Vanderbilts weren't just building homes. They were constructing empires, starting with Cornelius Vanderbilt's empire shaping wealth. The story begins not with architecture, but with iron and steam. Cornelius Vanderbilt, known to all as the Commodore, built his fortune on railroads that stretched across the American continent like veins of steel. By 1877, when he died, his estate was worth over $100 million. In today's money, that's roughly $2.5 billion, but numbers alone don't capture what this meant. One man controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury held in gold. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited this staggering fortune and promptly doubled it within 8 years. William worked with a singular focus that bordered on obsession. He reorganized the railroad empire, bought out competitors, and expanded routes until the family name became synonymous with American industry itself. The wealth accumulated at a rate that defied comprehension. $200 million by 1885, the equivalent of $5 billion today. But wealth of this magnitude demands expression. It hungers for form and the rigid social hierarchy of Gilded Age America. Old money looked down on new money with aristocratic disdain. The Vanderbilts were railroad money, dirty money, industrial money. They were excluded from the drawing rooms of the Astors and the ballrooms of the old Knickerbocker families who traced their lineage back to Dutch settlers. This exclusion stung, so the Vanderbilts decided to build something that couldn't be ignored, something that would force society to acknowledge their power. They would construct palaces so magnificent, so overwhelming in their grandeur, that the old families would have no choice but to open their doors. The first attempts were almost modest. William Henry built a mansion at 645th Avenue in New York. Triple townhouses connected into one massive residence. But it wasn't enough. His children wanted more. They inherited not just wealth, but a burning need to prove themselves. To transform industrial millions into cultural immortality. George Washington Vanderbilt II, William's youngest son, was different from his brothers. Bookish, refined. He spoke 8 languages and collected rare manuscripts. While his brothers played the role of railroad barons, George dreamed of something else entirely. He dreamed of a monument that would outlast them all. The stage was set, the wealth was there, the ambition was there. All that remained was to find the right piece of earth and begin building. The first palace, beginnings of excess. The Biltmore was more than a home. It was a statement to the world that wealth had no limits. In 1888, George Vanderbilt traveled to Asheville, North Carolina. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose around him in waves of ancient stone. The air was clean. The land was cheap. He bought 125,000 acres of forest and farmland for what amounted to pocket change from his inheritance. Then he hired two men who would help him build something unprecedented in American history. Richard Morris Hunt was America's first architect trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He understood European grandeur. He knew how to make stone speak of power. Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park, would shape the grounds into a living work of art. Together, they began to dream. The house would be modeled after a French chateau, not a small one, the largest. It would contain 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces. The main hall would soar 70 feet high, its ceiling painted with intricate frescoes. The library would hold 23,000 volumes on shelves made of hand-carved walnut. The banquet hall would seat 64 guests beneath a barrel-vaulted ceiling that seemed to float impossibly overhead. Construction began in 1889. 600 workers labored for 6 years. They hauled limestone from Indiana. They imported European craftsmen to carve the details, stonemasons, woodworkers, plasterers who could shape ceiling medallions with such delicacy they looked like frozen lace. A private railway spur was built just to bring materials to the site. The numbers began to pile up like stones. $11 million. That was the construction cost. In today's money, roughly $350 million for a single house. The estate required its own brick factory, its own woodworking shop, its own power plant. The Biltmore didn't just occupy the land, it consumed it. Olmsted transformed the grounds into an Eden. He planted thousands of trees. He created gardens that bloomed in choreographed succession throughout the seasons. The approach road wound through 3 miles of carefully designed landscape, each turn revealing new vistas, building anticipation, until finally the house itself appeared. And what a house it was! 175,000 square feet of living space, 4 acres of floor. The largest private residence in America. It still is. But size alone doesn't capture what the Biltmore represented. This was a building with ambitions. It wanted to be a European palace transported wholesale to American soil. It wanted to prove that New World money could buy Old World taste. Every room was a gallery, every hallway a museum corridor. George filled it with treasures, paintings by Renoir, tapestries from the 16th century, furniture that once belonged to Napoleon. The house opened on Christmas Eve, 1895. George invited family and friends for the first celebration in his completed dream. They walked through rooms that glittered with electric light, a modern marvel in the age of gaslight. They marveled at the indoor swimming pool, the bowling alley, the gymnasium. They stood in the winter garden beneath a glass ceiling and looked up at stars filtered through engineered perfection. The Biltmore announced to America that the Vanderbilts had arrived. They weren't just rich, they were royalty. But a question lingered in those vast, echoing rooms. A question that would define the family's future. If you build a palace, who do you build it for? And what happens when the palace demands more than you can give? When the world wasn't enough? The Biltmore was just the first. Vanderbilt wealth demanded more. And so, the family started building more. George's brothers and cousins watched the Biltmore rise and felt their own ambitions ignite. If George could build a French chateau in the mountains, they would build Italian villas on the coast, German castles on Long Island, marble palaces on Fifth Avenue. The competition became a kind of madness. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, George's older brother, commissioned the largest private house ever built in New York City. The breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, followed. Another Hunt design. 70 rooms perched on 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Built in just 2 years. $7 million, every surface covered in marble or gilt or hand-painted murals. The house contained so much gold leaf that restoration workers decades later would harvest it and sell it by the pound. Willie K. Vanderbilt built Marble House, also in Newport. $11 million for 50 rooms. The ballroom was modeled after Versailles. $500,000 worth of marble lined the walls. The chairs in the dining room weighed so much that footmen had to move them for guests. Alva Vanderbilt, Willie's wife, used Marble House as a weapon. She threw parties so lavish, so exclusive, that even the Astors had to acknowledge her. Her costume ball in 1883 became legendary. 1,200 guests. $250,000 spent on decorations alone. She dressed as a Venetian princess. Her sister-in-law came as a light bulb, an actual working electric bulb powered by batteries hidden in her dress. The houses multiplied. Hyde Park, Beaulieu, Idle Hour, Floor Ham, each one trying to outdo the last, each one consuming more money, more land, more resources. The family spread across the eastern seaboard like a conquering army, planting flags in the form of 100-room mansions. But these weren't homes in any traditional sense. They were stages, props for the performance of wealth. The Vanderbilts moved between them like actors changing sets. Summer in Newport, fall in the Adirondacks, winter in New York, spring at Biltmore. They employed hundreds of staff to keep the houses ready. Gardeners, cooks, maids, butlers, drivers, guards. At the breakers, 70 servants lived in the upper floors and basement. They worked in spaces designed to keep them invisible. Hidden staircases, narrow hallways, doors disguised as wood panels. The family could move through their palace without ever seeing the people who made it function. The houses themselves began to take on personalities. The breakers stood defiant against the ocean, its stone facade weathered by salt spray. Marble House gleamed like a temple, cold and perfect. The Biltmore sprawled across the mountains, absorbing the landscape into itself. And still the building continued. Frederick Vanderbilt built a 50-room mansion in Hyde Park overlooking the Hudson River. The house contained art worth millions, furniture commissioned from Europe's finest craftsmen, grounds designed by the same landscape architects who shaped Central Park. The total cost of the Vanderbilt building spree between 1885 and 1915 reached staggering heights. Conservative estimates put it at $75 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $2 billion. 10 palaces, thousands of rooms, acres of manicured grounds. But here's what makes the story tragic. The houses were rarely occupied. The breakers saw the family for perhaps 6 weeks a year. Marble House stood empty 9 months out of 12. Even the Biltmore, George's beloved chateau, felt his presence for only a few months each year. The palaces waited. They demanded maintenance. They required armies of workers to keep them from decaying. They consumed money the way furnaces consume coal. And slowly, quietly, they began to devour the fortune that created them. The inhabitants, ghosts of a golden age. Though they spent fortunes building these houses, the Vanderbilts rarely lived in them, their presence little more than a fleeting image in the grand halls. Walk through the breakers today and you'll see ropes stretched across doorways, signs asking you not to touch. The rooms are frozen in time, preserved exactly as they looked in 1895. The beds are made, the tables are set. Fresh flowers sit in vases, replaced weekly by museum staff. But no one sleeps here. No one eats here. the house has become a beautiful corpse. This was always true, even when the Vanderbilts owned it. Cornelius II and his wife Alice treated the breakers like a summer cottage, despite its 70 rooms and 13,000 square foot footprint. They arrived in late June with trunks full of clothes, staff in tow, and departed in early September. The rest of the year, the house stood empty. Sheets covered the furniture, shutters closed against winter storms. A skeleton crew of caretakers walked the halls, checking for leaks, fighting off decay. The same pattern repeated at every Vanderbilt estate. Marble House saw Alva for a few weeks in summer. The New York mansion stood dark for months while the family traveled to Europe. Even George, who loved Biltmore more than any of them loved their houses, spent less than half the year in residence. Why build palaces you don't inhabit? The question haunted every Vanderbilt property. The answer lies in understanding what these houses actually were. They weren't homes. They were investments in social currency. Every room, every marble column, every gold-leafed ceiling was a down payment on acceptance. The old money families of New York and Newport judged newcomers by their possessions. You couldn't just be rich, you had to prove it, constantly, ostentatiously, without apology. So the Vanderbilts built, and built, and built. Each house was a billboard advertising their wealth. The more extravagant, the better. The less practical, the more impressive. A 70-room cottage for 6 weeks of summer occupancy made a certain kind of sense in this world. It showed you had money to waste. That was the point. But the houses knew. They felt the absence. The Biltmore's 250 rooms echoed with emptiness. The bowling alley gathered dust. The swimming pool reflected nothing but shadows. The library's 23,000 books sat unread, their leather bindings cracking slowly in the controlled climate. The buildings began to develop their own rhythms, divorced from human occupation. At the breakers, the ballroom's crystal chandeliers swayed slightly in the ocean breeze that crept through gaps in the windows. The music room's piano held its tuning for months without being played. The dining room's 50-foot table stretched out like a stage awaiting actors who never arrived. Staff outnumbered family by staggering ratios. At Biltmore, George employed over 80 people to maintain the house and grounds. Gardeners, housemaids, footmen, a full-time florist, an estate manager, a wine steward. Most of them saw George less than the tourists who would eventually walk these halls. The servants knew the house more intimately than its owner did. They polished banisters he never touched. They cleaned rooms he never entered. They kept the machine running so it would be ready when, if, he decided to use it. The children born into this world grew up surrounded by grandeur, but starved of genuine home. Gertrude Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's daughter, later wrote about the loneliness of the breakers, how she would wander its halls feeling lost despite knowing every corner, how the house felt like a museum she happened to live in rather than a place that belonged to her. The emotional cost mounted in ways harder to measure than construction expenses. The Vanderbilts created beautiful prisons. They built monuments to wealth that isolated them from normal human experience. You can't invite friends over casually when your house has a staff of 80 and a banquet hall designed for state dinners. You can't relax in a sitting room when every chair costs more than a working man's annual salary. The houses demanded performance, always. The Vanderbilts could never simply be. They had to inhabit their wealth consciously, deliberately, exhaustingly. Every meal was a formal affair. Every gathering had to justify the setting. The pressure to fill these spaces with events worthy of their grandeur must have been crushing, and so they fled. To Europe, to smaller houses, to anywhere that didn't require them to be caretakers of their own monuments. The palaces stood and waited, patient, hungry, knowing that sooner or later their owners would have to return and face what they'd created. The question shifted. It wasn't why build houses you don't live in. It was darker. Can you ever truly inhabit something built primarily for other people to envy? When the numbers stopped making sense. Behind the glamour, there were numbers, the staggering cost of these palaces, and the mounting debt they created. Let's talk about what it actually cost to keep one of these houses breathing. The Biltmore required a staff of 80 people working full-time. Each person earned between $400 and $1,200 per year, depending on position. That's a minimum annual payroll of $32,000. Add in the cost of housing them, feeding them, providing uniforms and supplies. The number climbs to 40,000. In modern dollars, roughly 1.2 million annually just for staffing. But people were the cheapest part. The estate consumed coal by the trainload to heat its massive rooms. The power plant required constant maintenance. The house had its own farm to supply food for staff and family, but it operated at a loss, requiring additional investment every year. The dairy alone cost $20,000 annually to maintain. Then came the grounds. Frederick Law Olmsted's masterpiece demanded armies of gardeners. The approach road needed constant upkeep. Trees required pruning. Gardens needed replanting. Water features had to be cleaned and repaired. Conservatively, grounds maintenance ate another $25,000 each year. Now add repairs. A house with 175,000 square feet of space ages constantly. Roofs leak, stonework cracks, windows break, paint fades. The building's sheer scale meant that by the time you finished repainting the exterior, the side you started on needed repainting again. Maintenance costs ran at least $30,000 annually, more in bad years. We're at $95,000 per year minimum. That's over $2.8 million in today's money every single year. To maintain a house that George Vanderbilt occupied perhaps 4 months annually. The math gets worse when you zoom out. Cornelius Vanderbilt II's New York mansion cost $1.5 million to build in 1883. But the annual property taxes alone reached $50,000. The house required a staff of 40. Coal, gas, electric, water, repairs. Annual operating costs exceeded $100,000. He paid the equivalent of $3 million each year to maintain a house he used perhaps 6 months out of 12. Multiply this across 10 major estates. Factor in the smaller properties, the hunting lodges, the vacation homes. Conservative estimates put the total annual maintenance cost for all Vanderbilt properties at over $1 million in period money. $30 million today, every year, just to keep empty rooms dusted and gardens trimmed. Even for the Vanderbilts, this wasn't sustainable. William Henry Vanderbilt, who inherited $100 million and doubled it, left his fortune to be divided among 8 children. Each received roughly $23 million. Sounds like infinite wealth. It wasn't. At the spending rates they maintained, at the construction costs they accumulated, those fortunes would last perhaps 30 years before requiring significant lifestyle changes. And that's assuming the money just sat there, earning modest returns. But it didn't sit. The heirs built more houses. They threw more parties. They competed with each other in displays of excess that would have made their grandfather weep. Alva Vanderbilt's costume ball in 1883 cost $250,000 for a single night. That's $7.5 million in modern terms for one party. The Vanderbilts threw dozens of such events every year. The social season demanded it. If you wanted to maintain your position, you had to spend lavishly, constantly, without restraint. The houses themselves became financial vampires. They didn't just cost money to build. They demanded endless feeding, every year, forever. And unlike investments that produce returns, these palaces produced nothing but prestige. You couldn't rent them out. You couldn't even sell them easily. Who else could afford to maintain a 250-room chateau? George Vanderbilt felt this pressure most acutely. He wasn't a businessman like his brothers. He didn't have additional income from railroads or investments. His inheritance was finite. $20 million sounds infinite, but when you're spending over $100,000 annually just on house maintenance, when you're buying European art and rare books, when you're supporting a small village worth of employees, the money drains faster than you'd believe. By 1900, barely 5 years after Biltmore's completion, George's finances were strained. He sold 60,000 acres of the estate to the federal government. They became part of Pisgah National Forest. He needed the cash. The house was eating his fortune alive. Other family members faced similar reckonings. Frederick Vanderbilt spent millions building and maintaining his Hyde Park mansion. His wife Louise complained in letters about the endless costs. The house felt like an obligation rather than a pleasure. A beautiful burden they couldn't put down without losing face. The cruel irony was that the houses became most expensive precisely when they were least used. An empty house decays faster than an occupied one. Humidity builds, insects invade, pipes freeze. The buildings needed human presence to stay healthy, but that presence itself cost a fortune to maintain. Some did the math and stepped back. They closed wings of mansions, they reduced staff. They spent more time abroad where living like nobility cost less than maintaining American palaces. But the houses remained, waiting, demanding, slowly devouring the fortunes that gave them life. The question was no longer whether these palaces were worth building. It was whether they could survive their own appetite. The vanishing act, from triumph to tragedy. Just as they had arrived, the Vanderbilts began to fade. Empty rooms and crumbling fortunes turned their castles into relics. The first crack appeared in 1912. The Titanic sank on April 15th, taking with it 1,500 souls. Among them was Margaret Brown, who would later be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown. But the disaster also marked a symbolic turning point for the Gilded Age elite. John Jacob Astor IV died in the freezing water, the world's wealthiest man, choosing to go down with the ship while women and children escaped in lifeboats. The era of absolute confidence was ending. George Vanderbilt felt it. His beloved Biltmore, once a symbol of unlimited possibility, had become a chain around his finances. In 1914, he and his wife Edith traveled to Washington, D.C. George wasn't feeling well. Appendicitis, the doctor said, a routine procedure. But something went wrong during the operation. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died. He was 51 years old. The house had outlived its creator. Edith inherited Biltmore and immediately faced an impossible situation. The estate required $100,000 annually to maintain. George's fortune, once substantial, had been significantly depleted by years of supporting his dream. The property taxes alone threatened to force a sale. Edith made difficult decisions. She sold more land. She reduced staff. She closed entire wings of the house. The Biltmore began its slow transformation from private palace to something else, something less grand, more desperate. World War I accelerated everything. The conflict overseas disrupted the European travel that had been essential to Vanderbilt's social life. It made displays of extreme wealth seem tasteless. Suddenly, maintaining a 200-room mansion while young, men died in French trenches felt obscene. Labor costs skyrocketed. The staff that once worked for $400 annually now demanded more. Immigration restrictions reduced the supply of European-trained servants. The machinery that kept these palaces running began to break down. Then came the death blow. October 29, 1929. The stock market crashed. Fortunes built on paper evaporated overnight. The Vanderbilts, who had diversified into stocks and bonds, watched their wealth collapse. Not completely, they weren't destitute. But the era of unlimited spending ended abruptly. Harold Vanderbilt, one of William Kay's sons, saw his fortune cut in half. Gladys Vanderbilt, Cornelius III's daughter, lost millions. The family's railroad holdings, once guaranteed money machines, faced competition from automobiles and airplanes. The very industries that had made them rich were becoming obsolete. The houses felt it immediately. Maintenance budgets were slashed. Staff was reduced to skeleton crews. Rooms were closed. Dust began to gather on surfaces that had gleamed for decades under constant attention. Cornelius Vanderbilt III died in 1942. His Fifth Avenue mansion, which had cost $3 million to build, was demolished immediately. The property was worth more as an empty lot than as an inhabited palace. The Wrecker's Ball swung through rooms that had hosted presidents. Marble fireplaces were smashed. Gold leaf ceilings were torn down. The building disappeared in weeks. One by one, the New York mansions fell. Willie Kay's house at 665th Avenue, gone. Cornelius II's mansion at 57th and 5th, demolished. The city was changing. Skyscrapers were more valuable than private palaces. The Vanderbilts couldn't fight economics. The Newport houses survived slightly longer, but barely. They were too large for anyone to use as actual homes. Heating them in winter was impossible. The rooms that had glittered during summer balls stood dark and cold 8 months of the year. Some family members tried to donate them to the government as museums. The government said no. The maintenance costs were too high even for federal budgets. By 1950, most of the Vanderbilt children who had inherited the original fortunes were dead. Their children, the third generation, faced a different world. They had trust funds. Yes, but not the kind of money needed to maintain palaces. They sold when they could, abandoned when they couldn't. The breakers came perilously close to demolition. Gertrude Vanderbilt, who had grown up in its halls, refused to let it happen. She negotiated with preservation groups. In 1948, she leased the building to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. It would become a museum, a monument to a dead era. Marble House followed the same path. Willie Kay's magnificent $11 million statement became a tourist attraction. Visitors paid 50 cents to walk through rooms where the Vanderbilts had entertained royalty. The house survived, but only by transforming into something its builders never intended. A spectacle, a curiosity, a warning. The family's decline wasn't dramatic. It was a slow fade. Each generation slightly less wealthy than the last. Each sale of property another admission that the glory days were over. By the 1960s, the Vanderbilt name still carried weight, but the fortune behind it had shrunk to a fraction of its peak. The houses outlasted the dynasty. Stone and marble proved more durable than wealth. The Biltmore still stands in Asheville, now owned by George's descendants, but operating as a tourist destination. The Breakers welcomes 500,000 visitors annually. Marble House gleams in the Rhode Island sun, but they're no longer homes. They're monuments to excess, warnings about the cost of hubris, beautiful corpses preserved in formaldehyde, displayed for the education and entertainment of people who could never have afforded to enter them when they were alive. The Vanderbilts built to last forever. They succeeded, but forever turned out to mean something very different than they imagined. A palace to lose, the end of an era. It wasn't just the palaces that were lost. The Vanderbilt legacy itself was crumbling, one estate at a time. The demolition of Cornelius Vanderbilt II's Fifth Avenue mansion in 1926 stands as the symbolic death of the Vanderbilt dream. The house occupied the entire block front between 57th and 58th Streets. 137 rooms, built at a cost of $3 million in 1883. The grandest private residence in Manhattan. When it was completed, critics called it vulgar, too much, too ostentatious, a temple to wealth that embarrassed even other rich families. Cornelius didn't care. He wanted the world to see his power. The house delivered. Its red brick exterior stretched nearly 300 feet. The Great Hall rose 3 stories, its ceiling painted with allegorical murals. The dining room could seat 50. The ballroom held 200 dancers with room to spare. But by 1926, Cornelius was 24 years dead. His widow Alice had moved to a smaller house. Their children saw the mansion as a burden, not a blessing. The annual property taxes exceeded $100,000. The building required a staff of 30 just to keep it from falling apart. And for what? No one lived there. No one wanted to. The family put it on the market. No buyers emerged. Who could afford to buy it? Who could afford to maintain it? The house that had once symbolized ultimate success had become unsellable. So they tore it down. Newspaper photographers documented the destruction. Images show the Great Hall exposed to open air, its paintings still visible on walls as the roof collapsed. The marble staircase, which had cost $50,000 to carve, was smashed into rubble. Furniture that had belonged to European nobility was sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. The lot sold to developers for $2.5 million, less than the original construction cost. They built the Bergdorf Goodman department store on the site. Retail space proved more valuable than residential grandeur. The palace became a shopping mall. This pattern repeated across Manhattan. The Vanderbilt townhouses that lined Fifth Avenue fell like dominoes through the 1920s and 30s. Each demolition took months. Each produced hundreds of tons of marble, granite, woodwork. Some materials were salvaged and reused. Most became landfill. Willie K. Vanderbilt's house at 665th Avenue went down in 1927. The building had cost $2 million to construct. It sold for land value only, $350,000. The palace had depreciated faster than the cheapest automobile. Watching these demolitions, you see the Gilded Age ending in real time. Each swing of the wrecking ball destroys another monument to an era that believed wealth was permanent. That believed displays of excess would cement social position forever. The houses were built to last centuries. They survived barely 40 years. But demolition wasn't the only form of loss. Abandonment could be equally devastating. Idle Hour, the Vanderbilt estate on Long Island, suffered a different fate. Willie K. built it in the 1898, 110 rooms on an island in the Great South Bay. The house included a water tower disguised as a medieval castle keep, stables for 30 horses, a 9-hole golf course. The estate cost $3 million. Willie used it for exactly 12 years. Then he got divorced, remarried, and lost interest. The house sat empty from 1910 onward. Caretakers tried to maintain it, but without regular occupancy, decay set in fast. The roof leaked, water damaged the ceilings. The elaborate plasterwork began to fall. By 1920, rooms that had hosted elaborate parties were full of moldering furniture and peeling wallpaper. In 1924, the house burned. Whether by accident or arson was never determined. The fire raged for 12 hours. Firefighters from 6 towns responded but couldn't save it. The building's isolation worked against it. By the time adequate water pressure arrived, the fire had consumed everything combustible. The ruins stood for decades, a blackened shell overlooking the bay. Kids explored it on dares. Photographers captured its slow collapse. Nature reclaimed it vine by vine, season by season. The island eventually became a wildlife preserve. The foundation stones are still there, buried under decades of growth, a memorial to impermanence. Frederick Vanderbilt's Hyde Park mansion survived longer, but suffered a similar existential crisis. When Frederick died in 1938, he left the house to his niece. She took one look at the annual costs and refused the inheritance. No one in the family would take it, a free mansion worth millions, and no Vanderbilt wanted it. The government eventually accepted it as a historic site in 1940. It became part of the National Park Service. The house survives today, but only because taxpayers fund its maintenance. The Vanderbilts couldn't afford to keep it. The irony is almost painful. Each loss diminished the family's presence in the cultural landscape. These houses had been billboards advertising Vanderbilt power. As they vanished, so did public memory of the dynasty's dominance. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt name meant less with each passing year. Gloria Vanderbilt, Reginald Vanderbilt's daughter, grew up without access to the fortune that had built the palaces. Her inheritance had been burned through by her father's gambling and spending. She became famous not for wealth, but for genes. The Vanderbilt name on denim, from palaces to fashion branding. The trajectory tells its own story. The third and fourth generations scattered. Some married into other wealthy families and disappeared into those genealogies. Some made their own money in business or entertainment. A few maintained connections to the remaining properties, but more as museum board members than as owners. The Great Vanishing Act was complete. In 3 generations, the Vanderbilts went from controlling more wealth than the U.S. government to fighting over the scraps of trust funds. The houses they built survived them, but only as monuments to failure, cautionary tales in marble and gold, selling the dream, mansions to museums. As their grand designs fell apart, the Vanderbilts turned to a new way to maintain their wealth, turning palaces into public spectacles. Edith Vanderbilt understood what her husband never did. The Biltmore couldn't survive as a private home. After George's death in 1914, Edith spent years trying to maintain the estate the way he had imagined it. Full staff, pristine gardens, every room ready for occupancy. But the money drained away faster each year. By the early 1920s, she faced a choice: sell the property completely or find another way. She chose transformation. In 1930, Edith opened the Biltmore's gardens to the public for the first time. Admission was free, But donations were encouraged. Thousands came. People who could never afford to stay at such an estate could now walk its grounds, experience a fraction of the Vanderbilt dream. The response was overwhelming. Edith saw possibility. If people would pay to see gardens, they might pay to see the house. But opening a private home to tourists meant fundamentally changing what the Biltmore was. It meant acknowledging that the palace could no longer function as a palace. World War II forced her hand. The government needed secure storage for priceless art from Washington's museums. Edith offered Biltmore. For several years during the war, paintings from the National Gallery hung in rooms where Vanderbilts had entertained. The house became a vault, a service, something useful rather than purely ornamental. After the war, Edith's grandson, William Cecil, took over management. He saw clearly what his family had been avoiding. The Biltmore was no longer viable as a residence, but it could be viable as a business. In 1956, he opened the house to paying tourists. The transformation was delicate. How do you sell access to grandeur without diminishing it? How do you monetize excess without looking cheap? William walked this line carefully. The house was marketed as a historic treasure, not an amusement park. Tours were structured, controlled, reverent. It worked. Visitors came in droves. They paid $2 for admission, later $5, later $10. They walked through rooms roped off to prevent touching. They saw George's bedroom preserved exactly as he left it. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books sat on the nightstand. The money from tourism allowed the estate to survive. Entrance fees covered maintenance costs. The house could keep breathing. But at what cost? The Biltmore had transformed from a home into a stage set, a museum of its own history. The rooms no longer served their original purpose. They existed to be looked at, not lived in. Other Vanderbilt properties followed similar paths. The Breakers, leased to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948, became one of Rhode Island's top tourist attractions. 500,000 people walk through it annually. They pay $18 each. They take photos of the music room, the dining hall, the children's playroom. Marble House joined the roster of public mansions in 1963. Then Rosecliff, then the Elms. Newport transformed from a summer colony for the ultra-wealthy into an outdoor museum of Gilded Age excess. The very exclusivity that had defined these properties became their selling point. Come see how the other half lived. Come marvel at wealth you can't imagine. The business model proved sustainable. These houses generate millions in annual revenue. They employ hundreds of people as tour guides, groundskeepers, administrators. They contribute to local economies through tourism. In purely economic terms, they're more successful as museums than they ever were as homes. But something essential was lost in translation. These buildings were designed to be inhabited, used, lived in. Turning them into walk-through exhibits freezes them in time. The Breakers will never age beyond 1948. Biltmore is locked into the moment William Cecil decided to preserve it. The houses become their own mausoleums. The irony runs deep. The Vanderbilts built these palaces to prove they had arrived, to show they could afford to waste money on beauty. Opening them to the public admitted the opposite. We can't afford these anymore. We need your admission, fees to survive. The ultimate flex became a plea for help, yet visitors leave satisfied. They get something real from these tours, a glimpse into a world that no longer exists, a chance to walk through rooms that housed some of America's most powerful families. The experience has value, and the houses themselves seem almost content with their new roles. The Biltmore's gardens bloom for thousands rather than dozens. The Breakers ballroom fills with voices again, even if they're tourists rather than dancers. The buildings serve a purpose. They teach, they inspire, they warn. Perhaps this is a form of redemption. The palaces that nearly bankrupted the Vanderbilts now support entire communities. The excess that destroyed a dynasty now provides jobs and education. The buildings outlasted their creators and found new meaning in the process. But on quiet mornings, before the tour groups arrive, the houses feel hollow. The rooms wait for occupants who will never come. The dining tables are set for meals that will never be eaten. The bedrooms hold beds that will never be slept in. The palaces have become beautiful ghosts, haunting themselves. The last palace. Standing Biltmore was the last great symbol of Vanderbilt opulence, but even it was at risk of falling prey to the family's decline. In the 1970s, the Biltmore faced its greatest crisis since George's death. William Cecil had successfully transformed the estate into a profitable tourist destination. But profitability and sustainability aren't the same thing. The house was over 80 years old, 80 years of weather, 80 years of wear. The building was literally falling apart. The roof leaked in a dozen places. Water damage had compromised ceilings throughout the upper floors. The stone facade showed cracks. The intricate drainage system designed by Olmsted was clogged and failing. Windows needed replacement. The heating system, installed in the 1890s, was obsolete and dangerous. Renovation costs were estimated at $15 million. In 1975, money. The Biltmore Company didn't have it. Even with steady tourist revenue, even with careful management, the scale of needed repairs exceeded available resources. William faced the same impossible math that had destroyed the other Vanderbilt estates. The house demanded more than it could generate. The building's appetite exceeded its ability to feed itself. For the first time since opening to the public, demolition became a serious possibility. But William refused to surrender. He took a different approach than his ancestors. Rather than trying to preserve the house as a static monument, he would make it evolve. The decision was radical. Turn Biltmore into a working estate again, not just a museum, but an operating business. The grounds included 8,000 acres. Use them. The winery that George had started decades earlier still existed in rudimentary form. Expand it. Make it a destination itself. In 1978, the Biltmore Winery opened, the first winery in North Carolina since Prohibition. It produced 75,000 gallons annually within a few years. Visitors could tour the house and taste wine. The combination worked. Revenue increased. William kept pushing. He opened a hotel on the property in 2001, not in the main house, but in a separate building designed to complement the estate. Luxury accommodations for people who wanted to sleep near the palace, even if they couldn't sleep in it. The inn generated millions annually. Restaurants followed, event spaces, gardens expanded for weddings and corporate functions. The Biltmore became less a museum and more a luxury resort built around a historic centerpiece. The model was unprecedented. No other Gilded Age mansion had attempted such aggressive commercialization. Critics argued this debased the estate's historic character, that George would be horrified to see his private retreat turned into a wedding venue and conference center. They weren't wrong about his likely reaction, but they missed the fundamental point. The house survives. That's what matters in the end. The Biltmore stands because it generates enough revenue to maintain itself. The other Vanderbilt properties survived by becoming public museums funded by admission fees and government support. The Biltmore did it through pure business acumen. Today, the estate welcomes nearly 1.4 million visitors annually. It employs over 2,000 people. It generates over $250 million in annual revenue. The numbers are staggering. George spent $11 million building it. His descendants have turned it into a business empire worth an estimated $2 billion. But walk through the house itself, and you still feel George's presence. His books line the library shelves. His breakfast room overlooks the gardens he loved. The place retains an essence that transcends its current use. Yes, tour. Groups shuffle through hourly. Yes, weddings happen in the gardens every weekend. But the building remembers what it was. The conservatory still grows flowers year-round, though now they're sold in the gift shop. The approach road still winds through Olmsted's forest, though it's wider to accommodate tour buses. The house itself still dominates the landscape, its towers and turrets rising above the tree line exactly as Hunt designed them. Some rooms have been restored to surpass their original grandeur. Modern preservation techniques allow repairs that would have been impossible in George's time. The house is in some ways more perfect now than when it was built. Every surface gleams. Every detail is exact. It's become an idealized version of itself. But others' rooms remain closed to the public. The upper floors where servants lived are off limits. Storage areas, mechanical spaces. These parts of the house decay quietly while the public spaces shine. The building contains its own hidden history, its secret pockets of neglect that balance the obsessive care given to tourist areas. The fourth and fifth generations of Vanderbilts who manage Biltmore today bear little resemblance to their ancestors. They're business people, not robber barons. They understand balance sheets and marketing demographics. They've turned their inheritance into a sustainable enterprise through hard work rather than just living off wealth. This represents both triumph and tragedy. Triumph because the house survives and thrives. Tragedy because its survival required abandoning everything it originally represented. George built Biltmore as a private paradise, a place to escape the world. His descendants saved it by inviting the world in. The question that haunts the estate is whether this transformation constitutes preservation or destruction. If you change something's essential nature to keep it alive, have you really saved it? Or have you created something new wearing the skin of what came before? The Biltmore has no answer. It simply stands, the last palace, the survivor, a monument to both Vanderbilt ambition and Vanderbilt adaptation. George's dream endures, but only by becoming something he never dreamed of. The power of art over architecture. While the family's architectural wonders faded, their wealth lived on in the art and culture they amassed. The modern billionaire landscape looks nothing like the Gilded Age. Today's ultra-wealthy don't build Biltmores. They buy Basquiats. The shift happened gradually, but completely. By the 1950s, the era of private palaces had ended. The last great American mansion built for a single family was probably Hearst Castle, completed in the 1940s. After that, nothing. The wealthy built differently, smaller, smarter. But the need to display wealth didn't disappear. It just found new channels. Art became the preferred flex, acquiring paintings, sculptures, rare antiquities. These investments were portable, appreciable, and didn't require armies of servants to maintain. The Vanderbilts themselves had always collected art. George filled Biltmore with European paintings. Alva decorated Marble House with sculptures and tapestries. But for them, Art was decoration, a way to fill the walls of their massive houses. The buildings came first. The art supported the architecture. Modern collectors reverse this. The art is primary. The building is just a place to store it. Jeff Bezos owns a $30 million mansion in Washington, D.C. But he owns $500 million in art. Which defines his wealth more? Consider the economics. A mansion costs millions to build and millions annually to maintain. It ties you to a location. You can't sell pieces of it when you need cash. It depreciates from the moment construction finishes. A building is a liability pretending to be an asset. Compare that to art. A Picasso bought for $10 million today might sell for $50 million in a decade. It requires minimal maintenance. Climate-controlled storage costs thousands, not millions. You can move it anywhere. Sell it instantly to a global market. Art is a liquid asset that appreciates while providing social prestige. The mathematics made palaces obsolete for displaying wealth. The Vanderbilts learned this too late. They sank fortunes into depreciating real estate, while their art collections outperformed everything. If George had spent his $11 million on paintings instead of Biltmore, his heirs would be far wealthier today. Modern billionaires grasped this instinctively. Larry Gagosian represents collectors who own billions in art. They store it in warehouses, free ports, climate-controlled vaults in Switzerland and Singapore. The art never hangs in homes. It exists purely as investment, appreciating in darkness. When these collectors do build, they build smart. Small by Vanderbilt standards. A 10,000 square foot house is plenty. Why heat 250 rooms when 50 is comfortable? Why employ 80 servants when 12 suffices? The shift reflects changed values. The Vanderbilts needed to prove their wealth publicly. They needed society to acknowledge them. So they built monuments impossible to ignore. Today's wealthy value privacy more than recognition. They hide behind LLCs and trusts. Their homes are gated, distant, invisible from the road. Art provides a better signal to those who matter. Other collectors, museum boards, the art world elite. You don't need the public to admire your Rothko. You need the curator of the Guggenheim to respect your taste. That respect opens different doors than a mansion ever could. Museums themselves replaced mansions as monuments to wealth. Andrew Carnegie built libraries. The Rockefellers endowed museums. Modern billionaires follow this path. David Geffen donated $100 million to the Museum of Contemporary Art. Eli Broad built his own museum in Los Angeles. These buildings serve the public while cementing donor legacies. The tax advantages don't hurt. Donate art to a museum and deduct its appreciated value. Keep your house and pay property tax forever. The math favors art again. But something was lost in this transition. The Vanderbilt mansions were physically overwhelming. You could walk through them, touch the marble, feel the scale. They inspired awe through sheer presence. Art hangs on walls behind velvet ropes. It's remote, untouchable. The emotional impact is different. Perhaps that's intentional. Modern wealth seeks to avoid the mistakes of the past. The Vanderbilts built too big, too permanent, too public. They made themselves targets. They created monuments that demanded maintenance they couldn't sustain. Today's collectors learned the lesson. Stay flexible, stay liquid. Build for yourself, not for the eyes of society. Let your wealth work for you rather than working to maintain symbols of your wealth. The irony is that Vanderbilt art collections outlasted their houses. George's paintings from Biltmore are worth millions today. The tapestries he collected have appreciated beyond measure. If the family had focused on art from the beginning, they might still be among America's wealthiest. Instead, they built palaces that crushed them. Beautiful, magnificent palaces that consumed the fortunes that created them. The art survives in museums. The palaces survive as museums. But only one proves a wise investment: the rise of the machine. Where the Vanderbilts once wielded brick and marble, modern tycoons now wield technology and innovation. Jeff Bezos is worth over $150 billion. He could build 50 Biltmores and not feel it. He doesn't. He lives in a house worth less than 1% of his net worth. The comparison reveals how completely wealth expression has changed. The Vanderbilts poured their fortunes into tangible assets: houses, land, physical manifestations of power. Modern tech billionaires invest in intangibles: code, data, networks, infrastructure. You can't touch, but that touches everything. Amazon's warehouses dwarf any Vanderbilt estate in square footage, but they're functional. They generate revenue. They don't exist to impress visitors. They exist to move packages. The distinction is fundamental. The Gilded Age was about demonstrating wealth. The digital age is about wielding it. The Vanderbilts wanted you to see their money. Bezos wants you to use his platform. Different goals, different strategies, different outcomes. Consider Mark Zuckerberg, worth over $100 billion. Lives in a house worth $7 million. That's 0.007% of his wealth in his primary residence. For George Vanderbilt, the Biltmore represented over 50% of his net worth. The contrast is stark. Modern billionaires understand that houses are consumption, not investment. They provide shelter and comfort. That's enough. Spending beyond necessity is waste. Every dollar in a mansion is a dollar, not working, not compounding, not growing. The tech titans learned from watching old money decline. They saw the Vanderbilt story repeat with other families: the DuPonts, the Astors, the Mellons. Great fortunes evaporated through mismanagement and excess. Third and fourth generations squandered what first generations built. So, the new wealthy build differently. They create systems rather than monuments. They invest in businesses that scale infinitely. A railroad has physical limits. A social network can grow to encompass humanity. The leverage is incomparable. This doesn't mean modern billionaires don't display wealth. They do, but through different channels: yachts, private jets, exclusive memberships. These are movable, sellable, upgradable. A yacht depreciates, but you can sell it. A mansion depreciates and sits there. Bill Gates owns a house worth $130 million. Sounds Vanderbiltian, but it's packed with technology, smart systems, efficiency. The house uses less energy than properties 1/10 its size. It's engineered, not just decorated. The focus is on function at the highest level, not pure ostentation. Even when modern billionaires build big, they build smart. Larry Ellison owns entire Hawaiian islands, but he frames it as environmental preservation. He's restored native species, created jobs. The narrative is stewardship, not excess. Public relations matter in ways the Vanderbilts never considered. The rise of the machine represents a philosophical shift. The Vanderbilts believed wealth should be visible, solid, permanent. They thought in terms of legacy, buildings that would stand centuries, names carved in stone. Tech wealth operates on different time frames. Facebook is 20 years old and dominates global communication. Instagram was 6 years old when it sold for $1 billion. Value can be created and extracted rapidly, no need to wait generations. This creates different pressures. The Vanderbilts built for children and grandchildren who would inherit static wealth. Tech founders build companies they might sell within a decade. The wealth is mobile, liquid. You make your fortune and move on to the next thing. This also makes modern fortunes more fragile in some ways. A railroad, once built, operates for decades. A tech company can be obsolete in years. MySpace, Yahoo, Netscape, giants that vanished. The Vanderbilt's railroads lasted over a century. Facebook might not last 50 years. But modern billionaires don't care about century-long legacies. They care about impact during their lifetimes. They donate billions while still alive. They want to see results. The Vanderbilts built mansions they barely used. Modern billionaires build companies they run daily. The change reflects broader cultural evolution. America in the Gilded Age was becoming industrial. Steel, railroads, manufacturing, tangible things, physical infrastructure. Wealth meant controlling those physical resources. Modern America is post-industrial, information-based, virtual. Wealth means controlling platforms, networks, attention. You don't need to own property to own the economy. The Vanderbilts tried to translate their railroad wealth into social dominance through architecture. It worked temporarily. But architecture is local, limited. You can't scale it globally. Tech platforms have no such limits. Facebook has 3 billion users. How many people visited the breakers in its heyday? A few thousand annually. This scalability changes everything. Modern billionaires can impact more lives with less physical infrastructure than the Vanderbilts ever imagined. For better or worse, they wield influence that transcends geography. But they've lost something too. The Vanderbilt mansions still stand, still inspire, still draw crowds. What happens when Facebook dies? Where's the monument? Code deletes. Servers are recycled. Digital empires leave no ruins. Perhaps that's fitting. Each age expresses wealth in forms that reflect its values. The Vanderbilts valued permanence and visibility. Modern billionaires value flexibility and growth. The palaces stood for stability. The platforms stand for disruption. Neither approach guarantees lasting legacy. The Vanderbilt fortune disappeared in 3 generations despite massive mansions. Modern tech wealth might evaporate even faster without physical anchors. Or it might compound into dynasties that make the Vanderbilts look like paupers. We're too close to know. But the lesson remains. How you express wealth reveals what you value, and those values determine whether the wealth survives. Legacy, the true cost of a dream. In the end, the Vanderbilts' most lasting legacy wasn't the buildings they left behind, but the lessons their rise and fall offer us. Stand outside the Biltmore today and try to feel what George Vanderbilt felt in 1895. The pride of completion, the satisfaction of creating something unprecedented, the certainty that he had built something permanent. He succeeded and failed simultaneously. The house stands. Tourists walk its halls. The Vanderbilt name endures. But the family that built it scattered. The fortune that created it vanished. The dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own monuments. This is the paradox at the heart of the Vanderbilt story. They built for eternity, but lasted 3 generations. They constructed palaces designed to cement their legacy, but bankrupted insecurities about their new money origins. The houses were overcompensation made physical, and overcompensation always fails. Modern billionaires seem to understand this differently. They build businesses that create value. They donate to causes that solve problems. They invest in future rather than past. The smartest ones avoid the Vanderbilt trap. They recognize that houses are consumption, not legacy. But maybe we're too harsh on the Vanderbilts. They gave us something, These mansions, preserved as museums, educate millions. They demonstrate what unchecked capitalism produced. They show both the wonder and the waste of the Gilded Age. Kids walk through the breakers and learn about inequality. Tourists visit Biltmore and grapple with excess. The houses became teaching tools, not what the Vanderbilts intended, but valuable nonetheless. They're monuments to ambition and cautionary tales about hubris. They inspire and warn simultaneously. And they're beautiful. That matters too. The craftsmanship in these buildings represents skills nearly lost today. The artistry in the details, the vision in the design. Whatever their cost, whatever their purpose, they achieved aesthetic excellence. They pushed American architecture forward. They proved that New World money could create Old World beauty. Perhaps that's the real legacy, not the family fortune, not the social position, but the buildings themselves, divorced from their creators. The Biltmore serves a purpose George never imagined but might appreciate. It brings beauty and nature to people who need it. The gardens heal. The architecture inspires. The house gives something back. The irony is that the palaces outlasted everything. The fortune died. The family scattered. The social position evaporated. But the stone and marble endure. The buildings got their immortality, just not the people who built them. This reveals a deeper truth about wealth and legacy. You can't buy permanence. You can't construct yourself into history through sheer excess. Legacy comes from what you give, not what you spend. The Vanderbilts gave us these buildings, unintentionally, against their will, initially. But they gave them, and we receive them gratefully. Flawed as they are, excessive as they were, unsustainable in their original form. We preserve them because they teach us about ourselves, about ambition, about the American dream and the American delusion, about what happens when you build too big, dream too grand, flex too hard. The Vanderbilt story doesn't have a villain, just people trapped by their own success. They won the game of wealth accumulation so completely that it destroyed them. The palaces were victory monuments built by people who didn't realize they'd already lost. Walk through these houses today, and you walk through a mirror. Our culture still worships wealth, still measures success in dollars, still believes bigger is better. The Vanderbilts pushed this logic to its conclusion and found it wanting. But we haven't learned. Maybe that's why we preserve the palaces. To remind ourselves where excess leads. To show what happens when wealth becomes the measure of everything. To warn that the price of glory might be higher than we can afford. The Biltmore stands in the Blue Ridge Mountains, exactly as George imagined it. Except it's full of strangers. Except it's a business. Except everything about it contradicts his vision, except the physical shell. The house survived by betraying its purpose. Perhaps that's the final lesson. Survival requires adaptation. The palaces that refused to change became parking lots. The ones that transformed into museums endure. Nothing stays what it was. Everything either evolves or dies. The Vanderbilt legacy lives in this tension, between the permanence of stone and the impermanence of fortune, between the beauty of the dream and the cost of achieving it, between what they built and what remains. The palaces stand as monuments to this complexity, and we stand in them, humbled and warned, inspired and cautioned, seeing ourselves reflected in their marble halls. The Vanderbilts built their palaces to prove they had arrived. Instead, they proved that arriving means nothing if you can't sustain. The journey, that's the truth these buildings whisper. That's the cost they reveal. That's the legacy they leave behind.